Hello and welcome to the Nexus. Today's show, pardon me, Donald Trump is claiming he could free himself if he's cornered by the Russia investigation. So today we're asking if he's really above the law, and we'll check in on that investigation. How close are they now to the president? We'll also be looking at the famous 5 convicts that Trump has pardoned so far. Why are they so controversial? And when 2 reality TV stars come together to free a convict grandmother, you know it's time for a reality check here in the Nexus. Hello, I'm Matthew Moore, and today in the Nexus is Donald Trump above the law, and does he have the right to pardon whomever he chooses? We're going to be finding out with our distinguished panel, including Greg Swenson from Republicans Overseas. We also have Keith Whittington, a professor of politics at Princeton University, and the regular Nexus contributor, Professor Scott Lucas, joins us as well. Well, so now we're all together and gathered. Let's watch our first report about the Russia investigation and if the president really is above the law.
The entire thing has been a witch hunt. There is no collusion between myself and the Russians. Zero.
For the past year, Robert Mueller has focused on one question. Did Trump and his campaign team collude with the Russians to win the election? So far, Mueller has not revealed a smoking gun, but he has pinned down and charged 4 Trump aides on other alleged crimes. First came George Papadopoulos, which left a lot of people asking, who's that?
What Papadopoulos did was lie, and that's on him, not on the campaign, and we can't speak for that.
He was charged by the Mueller investigation with lying to the FBI about the contact he'd had with Russian officials. Weeks later, Paul Manafort, the former chairman of Trump's presidential campaign, was charged with various financial crimes, as was his business partner, Rick Gates. Then came Michael Flynn, Trump's national security advisor. Albeit for just 23 days, he was charged with lying to the FBI about the nature of his conversation with the Russian ambassador. So Mueller's pressure appears to be working. Papadopoulos, Gates and Flynn have all pleaded guilty to certain charges and are now cooperating with the investigation in return for leniency. The only holdout is Paul Manafort.
Well, I think you all saw today that President Donald Trump was correct. There is no evidence that Mr. Manafort or the Trump campaign colluded with the Russian government.
So now Mueller has a number of scalps, but the man he really wants to talk to is not so keen to talk to him and is becoming increasingly belligerent.
The appointment of the special counsel is totally unconstitutional. Despite that, we play the game because I, unlike the Democrats, have done nothing wrong.
And not only that, Trump is now saying if the need arises, he could pardon himself.
As has been stated by numerous legal scholars, I have the absolute right to pardon myself. But why would I do that when I have done nothing wrong?
In the whole history of the United States, no president has ever pardoned himself. In fact, the Constitution merely says that a president has the power to grant reprieves and pardons for offences against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. So, if Trump expects Mueller's investigation to corner him, many legal experts say his best bet would be to pull a Nixon. In other words, follow the example of Tricky Dicky, who resigned in 1974 to avoid impeachment. He then got President Gerald Ford, his former vice president, to pardon him a few weeks later.
A full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon.
In such a scenario, Trump will be looking to his loyal vice president, Mike Pence.
Professor Scott Lucas, only Trump has the ego to say, I'll pardon myself.
Oh, I'm not sure. I guess Vladimir Putin could say the same thing over in Russia. But
we expect greater things from America.
Yeah, he's not the one under the gun right now. I think we've got to be clear about 2 things here, and that is there's a political and a criminal dimension here. Robert Mueller, in a way, if he talks about obstruction of justice, if he talks about illegal or unappropriate contacts between the Trump people and the Russians, that will build up the political case that Trump possibly should resign and leave office. it's really only at that case, I think, that we move to the criminal, which would be whether Trump, in fact, could appear in a courtroom, which, as you noted at the end of your package, is where Mike Pence comes in and could issue a preemptive pardon.
Well, similar question to you, Professor Keith Whittington. Let's say, hypothetically, Mueller indicts Trump on charges of collusion. Could Trump then pardon himself on that?
It's a genuinely hard question of constitutional law. Obviously, there's no precedent. I think their legal experts are divided about whether or not that'd be valid. I think almost everyone agrees, though, it'd be an impeachable offense if he were to try to do it, because it's clearly an abuse of pardon power. Right.
I find it amazing. You've got two professors here, and, oh, look, the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan. Everyone's not quite sure about what would happen. Unprecedented. Let's listen to him.
Mr. Speaker, do you believe that the president has the power to pardon himself?
I don't know the technical answer to that question, but I think obviously the answer is he shouldn't, and no one is above the law. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Okay, so if he gets indicted or charged, possibly he could pardon himself, possibly. But if he gets impeached, if Congress moves to impeach him, that's the one offense we're sure about. He cannot pardon himself in those circumstances. Is that right?
Right. He can't escape an impeachment or an impeachment trial verdict through the use of the pardon. But he could pardon himself for any crimes underlying that the House is trying to move to impeach him for. He could escape criminal justice through a pardon.
So let's talk about Richard Nixon now, what he did. Maybe that's his best bet. If that happened, if Congress started to move to impeach him, the best thing Trump could do would be to resign then?
I think that's what happens. I think you're not just talking about Trump in terms of his own possible criminal liability. If you get to this point in the Mueller investigation, you're talking about damage to his Trump organization, to his businesses. Yep. And the idea that the whole edifice could come crumbling down at that point, because there are a variety of claims that actually bring in the organization as well as the political side, then I think you basically put the pistol on the desk and say, look, do you really want to take this all the way, or do you want to resign and limit the damage?
And Keith, then Vice President Mike Pence, it would be down to him to pardon Trump.
Right, he certainly could. And if I were Donald Trump, I don't think I'd want to gamble on the courts recognizing a self-pardon. I'd much rather have a pardon from then President Pence.
I want to ask you, Professor Keith Whittington, Trump is arguing that the entire special counsel, the Mueller investigation, is unconstitutional. Any grounds for that?
I think it's a stretch. There is an argument about whether or not the special counsel has too broad of authority to have been appointed in the manner that he was, but I think it's a stretch to say it's unconstitutional.
Greg, as the token Republican on the panel, I want to ask you, if Mueller subpoenas Trump, what do you think he'll do?
Look, there's been a bit of mission creep here. The investigation, you can argue whether it's valid or not, but it's there, it's reality. For him to fire anybody involved with it would be a mistake, and I surely think that pardoning himself would be a mistake.
Well, let's look at the people in the investigation that Mueller has caught so far. We've got Papadopoulos, Gates, and Flynn. Do you sense that in the White House there is some concern here?
I don't think so. Look,
really?
I don't. Look, Flynn, they've got him on some technicalities. Even the FBI agents that were involved in the interview said that based on their evidence, it didn't appear he was lying. So, as I said, there's been some mission creep. And remember, there is a bit of this Trump insanity of whenever he does anything, there's going to be the Trump derangement syndrome, both from critics on the right as well as the left.
Professor Scott Lucas, come in. I mean, he's got 3 people here. They pleaded guilty. They're in big trouble. They want to save their own skin. Are they going to sell Trump down the river?
They already are talking to Robert Mueller. I mean, probably the White House needs the calming influence of Greg, because the fact is they are extremely rattled. George Papadopoulos, let's remind ourselves, is in contact with a London-based academic linked to the Kremlin who is promising damaging emails on Hillary Clinton. Rick Gates is the top aide to Paul Manafort, so he knows all about the finances into the Trump campaign. Michael Flynn is in contact with the Russian ambassador, talking about possibly inappropriate actions. These are very, very serious charges. These are not technicalities.
Sure.
as you put it that way.
Okay,
but once you start shaking down Mike Flynn and you start shaking down his son, he's probably going to do what's right for himself. Maybe not take the high road, but just make sure his son doesn't get put away.
That's a good point. I mean, that's just extra leverage they had on him, actually.
Right.
Look, so we've looked at whether President Trump can pardon himself. Now let's turn to the 5 convicts he's pardoned so far in his presidency. For some reason, the liberal fake news media is screaming foul over his famous 5.
President Trump has pardoned Joe Arpaio.
The president has pardoned Scooter Libby.
The president has pardoned Christian Saucier.
Trump granting a full pardon to Dinesh D'Souza.
A posthumous pardon to boxer Jack Johnson to correct the wrong that occurred in our history.
And the first pardon in office using his constitutional power to pardon goes to none other than Sheriff Joe Arpaio.
Former sheriff of Maricopa County, Arizona, was convicted of criminal contempt for what was described as racial profiling.
His pardoning someone who violated civil rights at every opportunity.
I thought he was treated unbelievably unfairly.
The president has pardoned Scooter Libby, the former chief of staff to then Vice President Dick Cheney.
Scooter Libby was under investigation, as were other administration officials, for the leaking of Valerie Plame's identity. He was convicted of perjury in that case.
My son took 6 photos of a lowest level of classification area, never transmitted those photos. They were on his phone, and he's sitting in federal prison.
The president has pardoned Christian Saucier.
Today, the president gave a full pardon to author, filmmaker, and conspiracy theorist Dinesh D'Souza.
D'Souza pleaded guilty in 2014 to campaign finance violations arising from contributions to a GOP Senate candidate.
The president said, Dinesh, you've been a great voice for freedom. And he said that, I got to tell you, man to man, you've been screwed.
A full pardon, posthumously, to John Arthur Jack Johnson.
Johnson was the first African-American heavyweight champ, and in what was seen by many as a racial injustice, Johnson was convicted of a crime back in 1913. That crime was transporting a white woman across state lines.
Well, let's go to Professor Scott Lucas again. A lot of cynics say that Trump is pardoning these people, and a lot of them are conservatives, because he wants to give a signal to the other people who are out in the loose there, with Mueller coming after them, that if you stay loyal to me, you stay quiet, I'll look after you long term.
Dinesh D'Souza, Joe Arpaio, Scooter Libby, these are all sort of heroes of the right, and Trump, by letting them off the hook for what were clearly crimes, is sort of playing to that crowd. But third, what you're pointing to is, look, if you're, let's say, a Paul Manafort, and you are risking, for example, a long sentence and thinking you're talking to Robert Mueller, what if Donald Trump says, don't worry, I've got your back? What if his own personal attorney, Michael Cohen, who knows the inner secrets of the Trump organization, is about to flip and cooperate with Mueller? It's like, Michael, don't do this. You won't have to do jail time. That's probably the most sensitive possibility for why the pardons are being done.
Greg, is that a fair point? I mean, we have a picture up here of Paul Manafort behind Ivanka, and just to the left there, coincidentally, giving a thumbs up is President Donald Trump, as if to say, hey, Paul, stay quiet, we'll look after you.
It's a bit of a conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
Again, I don't want to try to predict what Trump will do or what will happen here. Look, I mentioned mission creep earlier. They're getting Manafort on some crimes probably unrelated to anything to do with the Trump administration, what he was doing in Ukraine or the bank, offshore bank accounts, et cetera. So it's hard for me to predict. I will say my vote on the long list that you mentioned was they were all very, very good pardons. I'm glad he did them, with the exception of Arpaio, which I thought was a little much because he broke the law. Forget about the political correctness, but he did break the law.
But they all broke the law, didn't they? That's
right,
why they required
but there's
a pardon.
jaywalking.
Well, I just want to bring up a picture here of the 3 conservatives, just to reinforce it for our viewers at home. We have D'Souza, Arpaio, and Scooter Libby. Professor Whittington, these 3 of the 5 are all staunch conservatives. I mean, is that, it just tells you what he's doing it for, doesn't it? It's, you know, we'll look after you.
Well, it's hard to imagine that people aren't getting that message. And these are weird pardons in a couple of ways. I mean, one is they're highly visible, and presidents usually aren't that visible in issuing pardons. They're usually much more low profile. And these are also clearly motivated by the president himself. They don't go through the normal process of the Justice Department lawyers looking at the case and building an elaborate argument. It's just Trump deciding this is a good idea to pardon these individuals, and he does it very quickly.
Well, I just want to pick up on the man in the middle there, Sheriff Arpaio. It's weird. I don't want to get into his case, but how the liberal media deal with him. Here he is now being trapped by a journalist from MSNBC, and he's basically telling Arpaio, hey, you took the pardon, therefore you're admitting guilt. I'm not sure about that. Let's have a listen.
When you take a pardon, you're admitting guilt. Why did you take that pardon and admit guilt?
I didn't admit guilt. I said I was not guilty, and I say it today.
But you accepted the pardon, and you know under the law that is an admission of guilt.
No, I don't know about that.
Yeah, I don't know about that either. Look, Professor Whittington, I'm no lawyer, as they always like to start, but I've read somewhere, probably Wikipedia, that if you get a full pardon, it essentially scrubs out the conviction, even reverses the conviction as if it never happened. Yes or no?
Right. It removes all the legal liability from a conviction.
Oh, so that journalist has set a little trap for Arpaio, and he got it wrong there.
Yeah, there's no reason to think that a pardon implies guilt. There's no reason why the person receiving the pardon has to confess or indicate that they accept that they were guilty.
Let me go to Scott Ferguson now. I want to talk about Jack Johnson. Pretty uncontroversial in the sense that he's got a pardon now, and most people would agree that he deserved it, given the era he was convicted in. I want to ask you, though, we have a picture of Donald Trump signing it, and with him is Sylvester Stallone and Lennox Lewis and others. Is this just a measure to appeal to the people, or is it just that he was genuinely sympathetic to Jack Johnson's case?
I mean, Trump may be sympathetic to the case, but there's two things here. First is there's the notion of celebrity that's here with this, as is the case with Alice Marie Johnson, who Kim Kardashian intervened on behalf of. And second is, you know, Jack Johnson happens to be African American. So in a way, it's like Trump saying, look, I'm concerned about you folks, given that he has a very checkered, let's say, recent history regarding race and race relations.
He's always had links with Mike Tyson and others. Anyway, perhaps not the most savoury characters, but Alice Marie Johnson, you mentioned. Let's have a look at this situation here. There she is there, a grandmother. She was sentenced to life without parole for her first offence, although it was a big offence. And as you say, last week, Kim Kardashian. Yeah, let's have a little picture here of Kim and the president, two reality stars in the West Wing there, sitting, looking so comfortable with each other. And they're at the White House. Now, she was pleading with Trump to pardon her. No, she wasn't pardoned, Alice Marie Johnson, but she had a sentence commuted. We've got some nice pictures of her being released, actually, just in the last few hours. Let's have a look at those. There we go. Let me ask you, what is it about the case that made her eligible for a pardon, or clemency, rather, in this case? And again, was it just the whole celebrity thing?
No, this is a serious case. This is from my home state of Alabama, and Alice Marie Johnson was effectively given a life sentence for a nonviolent drugs offense, and that's the key here. You know, there was no sense that anyone else was being harmed other than herself. She had served 21 years with no prospect of parole from the Alabama authorities. The case was picked up by an internet site a few months ago. Kim Kardashian saw it, took up the cause. And that's when it winds up in Trump's office.
Keith Whittington, if I could, she had her sentence commuted. She's been released. That's different to a pardon. Just quickly explain that.
Yeah, it's different from the pardon in that it just reduces the sentence rather than wipes it out.
And now with Kim Kardashian, she and her husband, Kanye West, have the ear of the president. But for all those other thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people who want clemency from the president, do they have a chance?
Well, that's not the point here.
Oh, let's go to... No. Greg, I'm not criticizing the president here. I'm talking about the judicial system, the criminal justice system. I want to know if those people have a chance of getting their appeal heard. Professor Whittington?
Yeah, there's certainly a chance. There's a normal process in the Department of Justice. So there are lawyers that specifically are assigned to look at pardon requests, and they prepare files to try to examine whether or not a given pardon is justified.
I understand it's highly bureaucratic and takes a heck of a long time. You'll probably die before it happens.
Well, not necessarily that long, but it does take a while.
Is there a drive here to change the criminal justice system? I heard that Kim Kardashian was speaking with Jared Kushner, the son-in-law of the president, and Jared Kushner's father was a convict. Is there a push here in the Trump presidency to reform this part of the system?
These were shortcuts. The Justice Department was not handling these cases. They were brought up around the Justice Department. Trump didn't consult the Justice Department when he decides to pardon. That's the first distinction here. The second distinction here is because Trump is doing this, what you have now is the wives and relatives of those who have been convicted, if they can get onto Fox TV, who are now making personal appeals. And Trump is feeding this because he says, for example, I might pardon Martha Stewart, the very famous TV celebrity, for housemaking, for cooking. He says, I might pardon Illinois Governor Rod Blagojevich.
We're going to come to those guys in a minute, actually. Scott, let me just jump in there for a second. You know, Donald Trump's critics accuse him of pardoning people as if he were a king, as we've just heard, but without the monarch's grace and breeding. I mean, they always twist the knife, don't they? But it seems a bit unfair when you open up the history books.
The American Revolution did away with the king nearly 2.5 centuries ago, but the President of the United States has always enjoyed that one kingly privilege, the power to pardon. Starting with George Washington. He granted America's first presidential pardons to 2 tax rioters in the Whiskey Rebellion. Abraham Lincoln pardoned soldiers who had deserted during the Civil War. But history's top 3 pardoners all came in the 20th century. Franklin D. Roosevelt pardoned the most people by far, 2,819. But that was over 4 terms. Harry Truman is in second place, pardoning about 2/3 of that number. And then comes Dwight Eisenhower, who pardoned about 1/3 compared to FDR. Modern presidents, though, well, while they still enjoy pardoning the Thanksgiving turkey,
I grant Marshmallow and Yam a presidential pardon.
they are pardoning far fewer people these days. George W. Bush pardoned 189 people during his 2 terms. Barack Obama, a little more at 212. As for Trump, well, just 5 in the past year and a half. You'd think it'd be a lot more given all the furore.
President Trump seemingly passing out pardons to heroes of the far right almost as eagerly as Oprah once gifted Pontiacs to suburban moms.
Critics say he's using his powers to pardon to help his friends and allies. But is this really anything new? Bill Clinton went wild on his last day in office, pardoning 140 people. The beneficiaries included the aptly named and very wealthy Mark Rich, whose wife had donated generously to Clinton causes. And always putting his family first, good old Bill even pardoned his rather troubled half-brother, Roger.
But my brother's the president. He just got through calling me before I came out here.
Yeah, that's Roger, a musician the Secret Service nicknamed the Headache.
How's everybody doing?
He always knew how to warm up a crowd, but he didn't know how to stay clean. Just a few months after his pardon, Roger was charged with drunk driving.
Well, there you go. It's okay if your brother's the president, isn't it? Scott Lucas, from one charming southerner to another. The truth is, they've all been at it, the presidents, haven't they? Looking after their friends and family.
Yeah, but once again, there's a question here regarding process. And when you mention FDR, when you mentioned Truman, that would have been a process through which the Justice Department reviewed a whole series of cases and said, look, these possibly need to be reconsidered. When you talk about Bill Clinton with Mark Rich, I don't think the Justice Department got in on that one as much as Bill Clinton basically doing a little bit of payback.
Why did they call it, I'm sorry, but why did they call it Pardongate then at the time?
Oh, at the time? Well, because you're in the middle of this sort of polarized America where it's like either Clinton is like an angel or he's the devil incarnate. This comes only after, remember, a year after he was impeached himself. And so the idea that he could have let Mark Rich off the hook for fairly serious crimes was sort of red meat to Republican opponents.
Okay, let's look at who might be next. Okay, we've got a little quad up here of 4 people. We asked our guys in the newsroom, quick straw poll. They came up with possibly Martha Stewart, Mike Tyson, Rod Blagojevich, and Edward Snowden. Let me go first of all to Greg Swenson. Which of those 4, or do you have another one in mind, do you think will be next?
It's hard to say. I mean, he's obviously
put your money down, Greg. It's always hard to say.
I'll say Martha Stewart, everybody's favorite homemaker in Connecticut.
Let's not let her off too lightly, right? She was convicted for insider trading. Oh dear, just because she makes nice cookies. Keith Whittington, who do you think's going to be let off next?
Well, now that you've said it, probably Mike Tyson.
I thought you were going to say Martha Tyson.
I almost did. Yeah,
Scott Lucas, who's your money on?
Stewart.
Martha Stewart. No question.
Yeah, it appeals to all those women that he wants to vote for him in 2020 if he survives the next couple of years.
Yeah, true. Well, pardon me for butting in, but Scott Lucas, thank you very much for your contribution to the Nexus as ever. We've run out of time. Also, Keith Whittington, thank you. And Greg Swenson, thank you very much for your contribution as well to the Nexus today. That is all we have time for. If you want to revisit any of today's topics or you want to watch any of our previous episodes, then head over to our YouTube channel. For now, thank you and see you next week.